Okay, so we're going to move on from rational choice theory and talk about the next choice-based theory, which is called routine activities theory. And I tend to abbreviate that with the letters RAT throughout the semester. So again, this is still a choice-based theory. We would consider routine activities theory to be in the same family of theories with rational choice theory and deterrence. But one of the big differences here, which you'll see as we go through the theory, is in routine activities theory, we're really shifting the focus and our interest toward victims of crime. In other words, this is more a theory of victimization than it is of criminal activity. And I think it makes sense that a theory like this got developed when it did, when you consider the context within which routine activities theory was developed. So, as you'll see, the first people that actually started officially writing papers in what they called the routine activities perspective happened in the late 1970s. And an interesting thing that was developing in the late 1970s, and this is after really the heyday of civil rights and women's equality movements, so hypothetically, the socioeconomic conditions in the country were more equal at that time than they really had ever been. Even though they were nowhere near completely equal, the point was, since the 1950s, the 1970s was a time when, ideally anyway, and most people remarked that we were moving towards a time when people were a lot more equal in a lot of different arenas. But another interesting thing that happened in the 1970s is that, as you know now in this class, the 1970s was a time period when crime rates were sharply rising to points that were higher than we have ever seen historically. So there was this disjuncture between the fact that socioeconomically we were moving towards better conditions, whereas crime was moving towards much worse conditions. So this was a problem that people really wanted to solve because it didn't seem like you could just blame poor socioeconomic status on criminal activity anymore, and vice versa. Another thing that was happening during the 1970s was, as you guys have learned about now, the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS, had been developed and was becoming extremely popular for researchers. Before this time period, we just didn't do work in criminology or criminal justice where we asked victims of crime anything. Nobody was gathering any data from victims of crime. The 1970s was really the first time when not only this became possible, but national level victimization data became possible for researchers all over the country to use. So there was this huge new interest in learning about what it is that puts people at a higher risk to be victimized. And it was in that context that this idea of routine activities theory really started to develop. Another thing that routine activities theory uses as its origin or its basis is a perspective in the 1970s called lifestyle theory. Now, this was, again, something that got developed really in the early to mid 1970s. And very basically, the idea behind lifestyle theory was that your lifestyle puts you at risk for victimization. So this is a victim-focused perspective now, talking about people who live risky lifestyles are going to be much more likely to get victimized. So in other words, during this time period, people made the observation that if you spend a lot of time out at night, or on the streets, or if you spend a lot of time surrounded by people in large crowds, like at stadiums or concerts, or out at clubs, you're much more likely to be victimized because you're increasing your risk for victimization. In other words, people who spend all day at work and then go straight home and spend all night at home are simply less likely over their lifetime to ever get victimized because their lifestyle is not putting them into situations that are likely to produce a lot of crime. So during this time period, people started to observe and do research on people who live the riskiest lifestyles and how much crime they experience in their lifetime. And it was from this perspective that two criminologists really set off in a new direction in criminology by developing what we're now going to call routine activities theory. So, as I've said, the ideas of routine activities theory really took a formal turn in the late 1970s, specifically by the work of two criminologists named Lawrence Cohen and Marcus Felsen. And they wrote a paper in 1979 formalizing this theory, routine activities theory, and testing the theory with data. So again, in their theory, they really expand on the ideas of lifestyle theory, that the spike in crime in the 1970s is not due to some rise in a dangerous class of people or super predators or any kind of a population shift, but rather their point was that in the 1970s, the general population, all of us, experienced a gradual change in our normal daily routines and lifestyles. So, they took a somewhat unique stance in this way on how crime fits into our society. So according to them, and this was a controversial idea at the time, but according to them, crime is mundane. It happens every day, and it is an inevitable part of our society. We are never going to not have crime in our society. So if this kind of idea sounds familiar to you, that's because they're basing this idea back in the original writings of people like Durkheim. The idea that crime is nothing special. You don't need incredibly elaborate theories to explain why people might commit crime because it is a feature of social and economic progress. It is intimately tied to changes. And the more modern and developed we get, the more modern and developed criminal activity can get. Now, Cohen and Felsen rooted their theory in a basic concept, which is that crime will only occur if three things converge in one place. And we call these things the big three in criminology because it gets tiresome to keep repeating them. But according to Cohen and Felsen, there are three things that have to happen in every scenario for crime to take place. The first is the presence of motivated offenders. Now, again, Cohen and Felsen say that the presence of motivated offenders in our society can pretty much be taken as a given, because committing crime to achieve goals is not really surprising to them or something that needs a lot of explanation. If crime is an easy way to get what you want, it makes sense that there are always going to be some level of motivated people out there that might want to commit crime. So this first one they essentially take as something given that's always present, the idea that there are people who have some motivation to commit crime. The second thing that they say has to exist for crime to occur is the presence of suitable targets. Now, their idea for what a suitable target is really for them varies on the kind of crime, but a suitable target which is in the absence of a capable guardian are the second and third things that have to converge for crime to occur. This is a pretty simple idea. The idea being that if a target seems suitable to either be victimized or stolen, and that target doesn't seem like it's being very well protected, it's highly likely that, given the amount of motivated offenders we have out there, crime is going to occur. Again, this is a fairly simple idea, and they were very clear, the authors, that if we take any part of these big three away, crime should not happen. In other words, if there are suitable targets but they're being well guarded, that should be enough for crime to not occur. Similarly, if you make targets less and less suitable and appealing to be stolen or victimized, that should reduce the amount of crime. So you can see why this is a much more victim-focused theory, because it's all about identifying the factors which victims can avoid and reduce to help them avoid being victimized. In other words, this theory is about teaching people how to become less suitable targets for crime, and teaching people how to more capably guard their possessions and themselves. Again, what you see is missing from this theory is a really thorough explanation for why we have motivated offenders, because for Cohen and Felsen, they just didn't think that was important to explain. The idea that people might be motivated to commit crime every once in a while, or even very often, isn't something that they found particularly interesting. What was more important to them was focusing on the suitable targets and absence of capable guardians. Now, another thing that makes Cohen and Felsen's theory and their original paper so unique is not only did they develop this theory, routine activities theory, in this original article, but they also tested this theory on data. So, Cohen and Felsen tested their theory on aggregate level US data starting around and after World War II. Now, the reason that they did this was, after World War II, the United States saw a lot of social and cultural changes that changed the routine activities that people were engaged in on a day-to-day basis. So to give you some examples of things that really started to change quite dramatically after World War II, Cohen and Felsen noted that around this time period was when women started leaving the household for college or to take on more full-time jobs. They also noticed that starting around World War II and moving up until and through the 1970s, merchandise was getting smaller and smaller, more portable, lighter weight, and arguably easier to steal. And Americans were becoming much more mobile. This is the time when air travel became more prominent. The interstate highway system was really getting developed. People were becoming much more mobile. They were moving around more. So you can see how these three things really changed people's routine activities and how this might have impacted crime over time. When you think about women leaving the household for college and jobs, not only are they becoming more suitable targets for victimization because they're out on the streets around people more, but their houses are being unguarded for a large portion of the day, making their houses suitable targets for property crime and burglary. So in that way, you can see how this one social and cultural change in our society, women starting to leave the home, really impacted a number of different crimes. The fact that merchandise was getting smaller for them played a big role in the amount of property thefts that increased from World War II to the late 1970s. And the idea of Americans becoming more mobile. Again, according to Cohen and Felsen, that's significant because it put people more in contact with people for larger portions of the day, increasing your risk of being victimized by moving about more, becoming more and more social, going out to stadiums to watch football games, going out to bars, driving into the city for a show. All of these things that Americans started doing were significant because they increased your risk for victimization. And using data starting in right after World War II up until the 1970s, they were really able to support their theory. People who reported the highest levels of all of these changes in their routine activities were also the people who were most likely to be victimized. So in that way, Cohen and Felsen felt that their theory had been fairly well supported. And their solution at this time was, if you want to lower crime, you need to lower the opportunities that people have to become victimized. Make people aware of what aspects of their routine activities puts them at risk for victimization, and target those things to make people less suitable targets and more capably guarded. Okay, so just to give you kind of a visual depiction of how significantly aspects of our lives changed from the World War II era up until even today, past Cohen and Felsen's work, just take a look at a couple progressions. So I'm going to show you a couple things that allow people to play music, and I want you to think about how much easier it is to steal them as they got more and more advanced. So we start out with something like a gramophone. Obviously a big clunky device that would be hard to sneak out of someone's house and walk down the street undetected with. The next one here, which your parents might be aware of, is an 8-track player. Again, smaller than a gramophone, but still kind of a clunky large item, and you have to plug in individual 8-tracks into it to play anything. Now, moving up into the 90s, when I was growing up, we had things like Discmen, where we put CDs in them, and often we had to carry around these really awkward cases full of CDs so that we could change CDs out from time to time. Obviously, Discmen were much smaller, much easier to steal out of someone's bag than something like an 8-track player, and obviously better than trying to steal a gramophone. But you still had to steal CDs to be able to play anything on your Discman. And what we've moved to today is things like iPods and iPhones that can play music that you've stored right on the device. So obviously now, while we've progressed to make things easier for the consumer to carry around, you have to understand that as we make things that are more and more mobile and more and more valuable, it makes sense that these things are going to get stolen at a higher rate. Making things easier to steal increases their likelihood of getting stolen. It doesn't mean that we have more thieves out there, it just means that over time it's become easier to steal things. Take another look at a depiction of how things like the television have evolved. So, when your parents were growing up, they had these big, chunky, 1 or 2 channel with a really small screen televisions. Moved on in the 1970s and 1980s to these huge console machines that are incredibly heavy. My parents had one up till about 5 years ago when I begged them to get a new television. Into the 2000s, we've moved on to flat screen, smaller televisions. And into our even more recent past, we've moved on to having things like iPads that you can store movies on and carry around with you. Again, as you look through the progression of how things have gotten smaller and easier to steal, it makes sense that property crime has increased, not just because there are more people or there are more predators out there, but because as things become smaller and more easy for us to all carry around, they become easier for people to steal. And this really goes along with routine activities theory, because as we're making our routine activities more mobile, we're making our devices more transportable, it makes sense that we're increasing their risk of being victimized. Okay, so as I've said a few times now, routine activities theory falls into the same group of theories with deterrence and rational choice theory. And routine activities theory, just like rational choice, is closely tied to deterrence. The reason for that is both of these theories are still about the choice to commit crime. Just like deterrence theory, routine activities theory assumes that first and foremost, people are hedonistic, self-serving, pleasure-seeking individuals. And for the most part, we will take the most efficient and easiest route to getting our goals. Sometimes that means making the choice to commit crime. So, routine activities theory is really focused on deterring future offending, but the difference here is that it's interested in altering choices to commit crime by informing victims what they can do to make their risk of victimization lower. So even though you're still trying to ultimately alter an offender's decision making, in routine activities theory, their goal was to make victims aware of what they can do to change their routine activities. So I would say that the main difference here between routine activities theory and deterrence theory is the fact that routine activities theory is much more victim focused. Most of the things that need to be altered and need to be addressed in this theory are things that victims need to do. What can people do to reduce the convergence of those big 3 things? Motivated offenders, suitable targets, in a lack of capable guardianship.